Good morning. Thanks for viewing this presentation of Comprehension Continued. You know, we've been talking a lot about comprehension, and I'll get to more of this one in just a moment, but I want to remind you that there is a second piece to this flipped class this week. That is differentiation. And in this module, there is the request that you view a video, take notes over the video of what you see the teacher doing, and how the teacher is differentiating instruction for each of his students in his classroom. Take notes over that, bring those notes with you on Monday so that we can talk about that and then get into a little bit more of some conversation about differentiation. But also then we're going to move into text features and text structures. Again, we've been talking a lot about comprehension. We did an entire notes-taking day on the 8 different types of building comprehension and how you can explicitly and directly teach students how to use these items to help their comprehension. It's not just those things that we do when we read that helps us understand what's going on. It's actually how the text is laid out. What's the structure of the text and what are some of the things that are involved in that text that help us better comprehend what we're reading? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Comprehension using text features and text structures. First, we look at genres, and in our example here, a genre that we're going to look at 3: the narrative, the informational, and poetry genres. Here you'll see subcategories of each, a quick description of each, and then some mentor text examples that you could potentially use in your class if you were teaching such genres in your classes. Narratives are stories, and they're usually fictional. Informational texts are just that, informational texts that teach or tell us how to do something. And then poetry, of course, is a very specific way of writing, generally rhymed, but can be unrhymed, like in free verse. There can be poems that are written as stories. For example, one of my favorite books is called Out of the Dust, and it's written all in a series of poems. And then haikus, which is a Japanese form of poetry using specific syllables in each line. So narratives are great to teach students. This is one of those that you can give your students choice in what they read. Know that contemporary fiction is something like what was released very recently, more modern times. Historical fiction has to do with stories that were written about something that happened in the past. Fables and folktales and myths and legends are all about those things that either create a moral or a virtue or a lesson, usually have animals as characters, all kinds of interesting different ways of telling a story out of fables, folktales, myths, and legends. Of course, fantasy and science fiction are those that usually predict a future society or a future population. One of my favorite books series is The Hunger Games, and it falls under the science fiction narrative subcategory. The example here under mentor text for science fiction, The Giver, is also a super, super good book. It's very interesting, very high level thinking for a kid to read this book. It has to do with life and death. I would suggest teaching it to older kids because younger kids might not understand at all what's going on in this story. But if you've not read it and you're interested in it, give it a try, especially if you want to teach older kids. It might be a great option to bring into your classroom. So to look at genre structure and genre features, each genre has a different structure and a different feature or different features. The narrative structure, again, we talked about folklore, fantasy, and those other types of subcategories under the narrative genre. For structure, for informational text, informational may also be called expository, and your students are going to know the word expository because they're expected to write expository texts on their 4th grade STAR exam. So start thinking of informational as expository because you'll hear that more than you'll hear informational text. But those are biography, alphabet books, and informational text. Of course, poetry, again, the rhyme verse, the free verse, and so on. The features, though, of each one of these genres differs, where a narrative feature has things like a plot and characters and flashback and foreshadowing and different things happening to characters in different places. Informational, then, does something to teach us something. So there's either a description that we're reading about something. There's maybe sequencing and things happen in a particular order. You can think of how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is an informational text that teaches sequence. Compare and contrast are informational or expository text. Cause and effect. Think of history texts that teach about the causes and the outcomes of the Civil War. That would be an expository text. And then, of course, problem solution. An article will pose a particular problem, and the research within the informational text will talk about how to solve that problem. Nonfiction features also very specifically lay out the information in the text. So there may be headings and subheadings. There may be photographs with captions. There may be graphs and charts and maps. There's generally a glossary to explain particular vocabulary. There might be an index to help you find specific information. So compared to narrative, an informational text is much more structured with more ways to find information. For poetry, there's specific vocabulary when relating to poetry. For example, we use imagery and metaphors in poetry. A lot of haiku, in fact, Japanese haiku should be written about nature. So a lot of haiku poetry has nature, natural imagery, and metaphor comparing something in life to something in nature. Onomatopoeia, rhyme, rhythm, simile, specific structure where poetry is written in stanzas, lines and stanzas. So each genre has a specific structure and a specific feature to explain that structure. We're going to focus on expository in this presentation as well as when we do our activity on Monday, just looking at the informational, the alphabet, and biography text. You see that example, Who Was Walt Disney? We see those books a lot now. They're simple reading and they're quick to the point information for your students to read. So this may be something you want to consider is accumulating a collection of the Who Was books for your students to read biographies. When we are teaching expository text structures, we need to teach each structure explicitly and directly. You don't want to hand a student an informational text and ask them to derive the information from the text without teaching them what they're looking for. So they need to know that there's a description text structure, there's a sequencing text structure, there's a comparison text structure, cause and effect, and problem solution text structures. The description text structure has its own description. Of course, in a description text, the author is going to describe something. And they'll use keywords like, for example, or characteristics are, or give some other description words in the description essay or text. The graphic organizer to the right is just a way that students could organize description information. That circle in the center would be the main topic, and then those little dots around it are connected, which are descriptions from the text about that information from the circle in the center. Sequencing is, of course, when the author lists things in an order. Could be chronological, could be in order of process, like how to solve a math problem. A lot of times in sequencing, keywords are going to be first, second, lastly, finally, then, consequently, therefore. You'll see the graphic organizer to the right shows just an arrow or series of arrows pointing to first step, second step, third step, and so on. Comparison texts. There are multiple items to compare and contrast. And in a comparison text, the author will take a look at characteristics of each of those things and describe how they are alike or different. Keywords for a comparison text for your students to look for are differences, contrasting, in comparison, on the other hand, same as. And you know, a Venn diagram is the best way to graphically organize a compare and contrast text. As mentioned before, the cause and effect text structure is generally used in history. A lot of times we're looking at an informational text that will explain to us why some event in history occurred and what the outcome was of that. That's the description of a cause and effect article. One cause resulting in a specific effect. If-then statements are very, very common in cause and effect essays or texts. When you're looking at specific reasons, why, because, those things lead us to something happen to make something else happen. Graphic organizer on the right has the center, the big circle as your cause, and then 3 effects of that cause listed there connecting to it. Or you could go the other way. The big circle could be the effect of 3 causes that made that effect happen. And then problem solution is an author has posed a problem, and then lists potential solutions, either things that actually happen or things that could happen. This happens a lot in science, especially when we're looking and talking about experiments and working with some materials to find out what happens when we modify those materials. The problem is, the puzzle is, solved by, those are all keywords in a problem solution text. And your graphic organizer just shows a problem stated at the top and then potential solutions, arrow to each potential solution beyond that. As for features in a nonfiction text, there are elements that organize our nonfiction text, especially if we're looking at books. Those books will be listed by title or chapter with headings and subheadings to organize specific information. Elements for locating information within a nonfiction text might be a table of contents or an index. Of course, page numbers. Narratives do have page numbers also, but this might be important to note that indexes and table of contents list what page to find specific information. Elements for explanation and elaboration, of course, are more information to usually graphically explain what's written in words, like charts and tables and maps. Elements that illustrate are anything that is an illustration or photographs, generally accompanied by a caption that would explain what's happening in the photograph. Usually the photograph on the page matches some of the information that's on that same page or in that same area of the same page. And then elements that notify. We know that if an author bolds words in an article or in a book, especially an informational book, there's some emphasis on that particular word. So there's a reason it's there. In informational text, bolded words may be new vocabulary words or words that are very important to understanding what's happening in that text. Italics is the same way. That's it. You're done with this one. We're going to practice the text features with a little activity that I have been using from the Florida Center for Reading Research. And hopefully by going through this data today, you will have a quick and easy activity that you could use with your students in your classroom to help teach these text structures and text features. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a great day.